Boardroom Bound, Episode 58, Insight into the International Boardroom with Maria Garcia Nielsen.
Our board's really just sitting to sign off on what the executive team is driving at, or are they really doing their job to ensure that they're representing all shareholders?
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Maria Garcia Nielsen, and we're going to hear her story of being an executive at a company and moving across and beginning to take her first board training because she wanted to leverage the experience she was already having with some nonprofits and some private equity, eventually to move up and be in a public company board. So we'll hear her experiences both at leading institutions like Harvard's Business School Board Governance, NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors Board Fellowship Program, and what that meant for her. And then after she had that knowledge, what she did with it, because it was still incredibly hard. You're talking to someone who's had a great career. She, as Maria describes herself in the show, ticks some boxes, right? She's a female, she's minority, she's got global experience, she's a technology background, and you would think for many people that would be so easy. There should be public company boards knocking on her door. But still not so. It's hard because you've got to do all of the networking stuff. You have to build all of the right documentation, the board bio, the board resume, etc. Maria will walk us through all of that. And because she found it hard, she founded an organization, the Women Exec on Boards, to help each other and to build each other up and prepare each other, hold each other accountable. So she's going to talk through that today. So this is relevant for anyone in our audience, male or female, wherever you are in your board journey, the lessons learned that she would share and say, this is what I would do if I were starting again. This is what I focus on now. This is the most important part. And you'll hear it from someone who's been very successful, but is still finding the challenge of getting on a board, which is a reminder for all of us that if we have this aspiration, it's going to take a lot of work to get there. And that's fine. We're all ready to roll up our sleeves and dive in and make it successful. So let's hear all of Maria's great advice today. Maria Garcia Nielsen, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, I am delighted to be doing a deep dive into the topics with you today because this will build on some of the previous episodes where we've talked about with people about you need to get almost more arrows in your quiver. You need to build some brand and some reputation. So some of the episodes we've had Peter Gleason, who's the CEO of the National Association of Corporate Directors on the show, and you are a board leadership fellow. We've also talked about some of the external groups that you can go to, like Harvard Business School has their own board governance executive education class, which you have done. And what I'd love to do is unpack some of that and what it looks like today. And you've got a great story about how you built on some of that material that you did. But just before we dive into it, set the context for people on this show. So you were growing and developing in your career, and at some point you probably thought, I'd like to go down this board path. So maybe help us understand how you got to that point and what you did to start down.
Yeah, so I've been on corporate board roles, executive roles from different areas and functions. So I've been a consultant at McKinsey for strategy. Then I ran my own company. I sold my startup to Jeff Bezos himself as he was expanding internationally. I was a search consultant. I worked for Spencer Stuart, and actually that was my first contact with boards because I was sort of a consultant looking for some innovative, internet-savvy board members for major banks. This was in Iberia, in Spain, and Portugal. And then I also worked for private equity. And through private equity, I did sit on boards, private boards, but basically looking out for our investments. So that was a board experience, but very specific to private equity. However, 7 years ago, I took a role as a CEO of Office Depot, the publicly traded company in Spain and Portugal. And with that came the responsibility also to be a board, the board member for the entity in Spain. So here I was representing a multinational, but with fiduciary duties for the subsidiary in Spain. But something else happened within that. It was after maybe 20 years that somebody from HR, from headquarters in Boca Raton, called me up and said, we'd like to talk about career development and your aspirations. And I think it was the first time that somebody external asked me questions about where I saw myself and how my career may evolve. And Office Depot was great to at least highlight or help me understand that one of the things that I did enjoy was this advisory role, this, a bit of a distance view of how companies need to evolve. And so they put me on the first course for board governance, and it was also at Harvard. They sponsored me, and it was a course called Making Boards More Effective. This was a co-ed course in July of 2016, and this was part of the training perk that I would get as being CEO of Office Depot in Spain. But that's when I came across the Women on Boards, HBS, basically a course that was basically being offered for the first time in November of that same year. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship for that course through Harvard, and I think that set me on a road to really understand whether that service element was attractive enough for me to devote my time to just having a portfolio of boards, both nonprofit, which had already been doing as a part of my passions. But I think they helped me. That course really helped me structure my thoughts around this is where I want to be, and this is what I want to do for the next 20, 30 years of my life.
And so let's break that down a little bit. So you've covered quite a wide range of board experience to begin with. So we've talked on the show, for example, private equity and venture capital are not what most people think of. We think of public company boards, but PE and VC have exponentially more opportunities, right? And they might be a little bit different. There are nonprofit boards that you talked about where you were doing, say, your passion projects. Again, very different from perhaps the big public company boards we're all thinking of. But then you went on this HBS course, and it probably changed a little bit of your mindset again. But for all of those different opportunities, there are some things in common that someone has to do to best present themselves and be positioned for them. How did you feel like you were in terms of developing those, like your board documents and your board bio before that versus your thought process after the course?
So before the course, I was basically just executing, right? So my major I think, most of my time was devoted to my CEO role. And if somebody had asked me, I would have said, I have no time for anything else than my family and perhaps one or two nonprofits, which I did. So I was, for 12 years, I was on the advisory board of my children's school. It was called International College Spain, but they had been bought by two venture capitals during the time that I was there, so I was able to advise them on the things that I knew best about, mergers and acquisitions, and they eventually were bought out by a company which traded in the New York Stock Exchange. So I grew with that company from a board and a director. As far as expertise, they trained us. We took our fiduciary duties very seriously. So even though it was my passion, it was also very professional. But that's about as far as my bandwidth, I think, allowed, because I was just so busy. However, when the Harvard course, both Making Boards More Effective and Women on Boards, I think they helped and they drove the message that if you do want to be on a board, the service aspect, adding value, collegiality of thought, that has to be something that's very important for you. At least that's what resonated with me. So it wasn't so much the idea of, this is something that I do on the side. They actually highlighted that, it is a serious responsibility. There are some legal implications. And the idea that you have to give back somehow according to your skills and your aptitudes, I think that's what made me more optimistic and really excited about pursuing boards, and not only any board, but the right types of boards where I could be that element of change. So we looked at some of the problems of current boards, some of the opportunities for diversity, for innovative thought processes, and that's what really got me thinking that there was something that I could that I could bring to the table.
So that's exciting. It's important for people to grasp this who are new to this idea that they're going to grab a board seat someday. Boards don't need generalists, they need specialists. And a specialist could be many different ways. It could be an industry that you're in, or your cybersecurity or social media, whatever it might be, and how you fit in certainly culturally and the value add and sort of the diversity of thought. I like the collegiality of thought phrase that you were just using there. So it sounded like, Maria, you figured out this is who I am and how I'm going to pitch myself in a way that's going to be rewarding. Having gotten that energy and enthusiasm out of it, did that adjust your mindset before you thought, no, my plate's already full? Did you realize I now have more room that I want to make on the plate?
Well, and again, Office Depot really helped me there. Talking through what I could do and I could not do. Multinationals are usually quite clear about allowing you to take just one role while you're an executive. So I was able to maintain my role in this advisory role for the educational the education sector, but I was also able to channel any training that I opted for. Both at Harvard, I also did the NACD, as you mentioned. I'm a fellow there. I also did the local institute in Spain. It's called Instituto of Consejeros and Administradores. It's called ICA. I also did their course. So any opportunity that I had to get training on the legality, because I think I felt very well versed on strategy, on the financial aspects, but not so much on the legal aspects. I think I'd always relied on external help for the legal aspects of my responsibilities. But when it is both a collegiate decision, as I mentioned before, but it's also you are independently responsible for the decisions and the papers you sign. I probably paid more attention to the legal aspects of those responsibilities as a board director during this time of getting trained while I was a CEO at the same time. Now, I left my role of CEO because the company, the international part of Office Depot, was sold to private equity, so my role was not relevant as far as strategy anymore, because it was a different private equity had a different outlook as to what the subsidiaries could do. So the role for the CEO, really made no sense. You needed more of a general manager, perhaps, rather than an independent board, and all of the different qualifications that we had prior to the sale of the international part of Office Depot. And that's where I took a very program, if you could say, roadmap to thinking, okay, how do I position myself? What are my skills? Where's the value add? And what is the road that I want to take for my own personal development? In the meantime, in parallel, I was very, very connected to all the alumni of the Women on Boards program. There were 60 of us in the first cohort. There were 90 in the second year in 2017 and 140 last year. But what really happened was that first cohort of 60 women maintained contact by having a bi-monthly call, or bi-weekly call. So every 2 weeks we would get on the phone for an hour and just ask each other, what are you up to? How are you doing? How has the course helped you? And we were a bit at a loss, but it just helped to understand that you weren't the only one that was lost. It helped to understand that other women were feeling the same pressures, were having the same questions, and were looking for the same answers.
And so, Maria, let's
really
break that.
took me on the road.
Maria, let's explain that a little bit to the audience. So I imagine for some people, they might be thinking, oh, I go to an HBS course on board governance, I leave with a fancy certificate, and companies should be banging on my door to put me on boards. And what you've done is thrown some cold water on that and said, no, it's still a hard process. You still have to probably do a lot of networking and other activities to find the right boards that are going to be a fit for you. Help us understand that a little bit more so that it's not necessarily a paved gold street that you walk out on the last day of the class and just magically go to where you want to go. Talk us through that process and what it's looked and felt like for you in reality.
Yes. So, for example, I was born in Peru, so I'm Latin America, and I'm an engineer. I've been working internationally. So, in a sense, I tick lots of boxes because of the technology, the global, Latino, female. In any case,
right.
There's a certain understanding that because it's so relevant, it's all in the news, that diversity is needed in the boardroom, that women will be sought out for, the roles that are available. And HBS, if anything, because of the brand, seems the most likely place for, high caliber boards to look for women. The reality for us, at least, for that first year, was that we did receive content as far as the fiduciary duty. The case studies were excellent as far as highlighting some of the pressures and the need for independent thought, the need for, a collegiate decision-making, and so on. However, as far as the practical aspects, we didn't cover things such as your board documents, the cover letters, the board bio, the board-specific CV or resume, your elevator pitch, and what networking, everybody told us that networking was the key to getting our board seats, what that meant. How do we approach? What does networking mean besides just giving out cards at any reception you may find? And so, as I said, we would get on the phone every 2 weeks. We set up this network. And what we're finding out, and we're still in the process, but it's easier as we do it together. There are 100 of us now. It's a global network. We basically we feel we're the natural extension to that the Women on Boards program, because we've already declared to ourselves and to the world that we want to do this. We want to get on board. We took the training, but we need more information. And so we have calls where we host people from the NACD, as you mentioned, from different service entities like Women in the Boardroom. Search firms have come talk to us just to give us advice and tips as to how to approach all those elements of the tactical way for us to be in the radar when board seats become available. So not only are we looking at the documents, as I said, we try to keep abreast of governance issues by having guest speakers come to regional dinners. And then we host an annual event. Last year it was in New York. This year it will be in Boston. And what we're hoping to do there is to have FaceTime with gatekeepers, be it people that sit on boards already, or that would be the actual person that gets asked the question, who do you know when a board seat may become available?
Right. And that's incredibly exciting that you have built this and you've watched the women execs on boards grow and develop. I think a supportive community is incredibly helpful, and we need accountability, right? I think true leaders who want to be successful always find people to hold themselves accountable, but also to help them and encourage them with each other. And so when I think about our audience, and I imagine some people who are saying, okay, maybe I'm a new board director and I didn't necessarily know what I got myself into, or I'm aspiring to be that, whether that's next month or next year. It sounds like you've gone through so much where you've learned and developed, and you've done a lot of the right things. You've gone and taken the training classes. You've been doing some of the networking. What are the key things that you would pull out, the top 2 or 3 of, I wish that I had done this when I had started back in the beginning?
I wish I had started with the, very technical elements, sort of the board documents. Just get them out of the way, even though they're living documents, because you have to keep looking, revisiting, understanding your value add for the specific situation at hand. I probably took too long to develop those documents. The second thing is that networking. So what I did in the end, when I said that I wanted a programmed approach, so my approach has been education first. Not only did I take the courses, I teach the strategic module for directors in Spain, because that's the best way, I think, to keep abreast of what's going on in governance issues. Then I wanted to have nonprofits, but very high caliber nonprofits. So I did network and try to understand, how do I get on. I went to Cornell University as an undergrad, and even though I've been an interviewer for candidates and been a sort of a volunteer for the institution for the last 20 years, I actually began asking, how do I become a trustee? How do I get more involved for that board road? And so just last May, I became a member of the President's Council for women's issues, and it's a 6-year term. So that process took me a year. I also became a trustee in a very reputable nonprofit in Spain for youth unemployment. Also took about a year. So I think I would have started that earlier, because this is very personal, but I feel that I want to make sure that I have enough bandwidth to tackle those issues that are very dear to me, rather than just be an executive, but now with a board hat rather than as an executive hat. So now that I have those out of the way, I've gotten my first private board role in Spain. I'm actively looking for a private board or a public board, small cap, in the U.S. In the U.S. road, what I did, I engaged with a service provider. They're called Women in the Boardroom. The founder is Sheila Ronning, and she was very pragmatic about looking at me and saying, okay, what do we need to, how do we network, and how do we leverage all of the different network opportunities that you have, because you're from Cornell, you're a Wharton MBA, you are former McKinsey consultant, you've done this Harvard program. And I think she was very, as I said, pragmatic to take all of that and narrow it down into, I'm going to call you every month, and I'm just going to go through with you who have you told and how are you being proactive about identifying what boards you're more, there's more propensity for you to add value. And that's been really helpful. We've taken that into our Women on Boards, the Women Execs on Boards program, and we already had an accountability group set up where every month a group of 8 or 12 women get on the phone and ask each other, are we done with our board documents? Who has had an interview? How can we help you? What are the questions that you're struggling with? And I think that very programmed approach to revisit, not just say, I want to be on a board, but set some homework and some moments of truth to revisit what have I done over the past few weeks has been very important. I would have started that earlier.
So that makes a lot of sense. And something else that I'd love to touch upon is you've had a lot of success is the word I'll use, from lots of different opportunities over time, where if you imagine your board document, your board CV, where you see that built out, there'll be some great stories, some great experience, which is very attractive. But something that you and I were talking about before the show started was that you wish that you'd got more feedback or had a more robust board evaluation process on your earlier board opportunities. Perhaps you can unpack that a bit for our audience.
Yes, so my initial board experience was, as I said, in private equity. And in private equity, at least my experience and what I've seen through some of the interviews I've had recently, it's more of a hands-on experience. In our case, we were really looking out after our investment, and although we were, of course, looking to add value, but it wasn't, sometimes we would take operational roles because that's what was needed for the investment. In some of the advisory roles, I've had proper board evaluations, proper an independent lead director, where board evaluations were an important part of our yearly experience. However, I haven't had public board experience. And that seems to come up often in some of the recent interviews for public boards opportunities that I've encountered. The chicken and the egg. They tell me,
right.
Well, all sounds great, but you don't have public board experience.
How do you get the experience without a job? How do you get the job without the experience?
What I do draw, though, it may be very relevant, and I'm learning that in the process, is that I'm still wearing a CEO hat. So in many aspects, I'm conscious of the fact that sometimes when I see a problem, I want to act upon it rather than just ask the right question. I think that's a skill that you have to develop, and that you have to practice, and that you have to be exposed. And that's why I'm looking for a smaller board with proper governance to sit on, because I think that I need to develop a bit more. I'm too executive still. And that comes across as I'm trying to be authentic in the interview processes that I'm participating in.
And Maria, I imagine, based on what you've said about how you've been gobbling up training opportunities, that there's probably a lot of spare time reading that you do on some of these subjects. Is there a book or two that you would recommend for any of our audience members as they continue to walk down their own journey?
Yes, I mean, I did. I think I was very fortunate to look at to do the NACD course. I think their content, if anything, it's not perhaps a book, but their content was very useful. I think to give you the general perspective of corporate governance issues, current issues, and so on. But in the first course, Making Boards More Effective at HBS. There was a professor, Jay Lorge, who had written The Future of Boards. And I think it was a reflection of, our boards really just sitting to sign off on what the executive team and the CEO is driving at, or are they really doing their job to ensure that they're representing all shareholders. And I really like that book. It's called The Reality of America's Corporate Boards. So he's a well-written, fast read, and entertaining as well. But it highlights the fact for the need for independent thought around the boardroom.
Well, Maria, you've given so much for our audience to chew on from this, from taking your individual situation and even with your illustrious career, is the great way I would describe it, and your wonderful board experience. I appreciate you being very open about, I don't want to say the word struggles, but the progress that you've been making, and perhaps not at the pace that you thought it would, as you move towards that next step for yourself, getting in that public company board role. So I appreciate your honesty and your vulnerability around that. And there's a lot that we can leverage and learn from. I'm encouraged to see that you are building the organization that's going to help other people, from your women exec on boards and your annual event coming up in October in Boston. So there's so much great ideas that people can take away from this. And if there's one or two things that just stand out in your mind, if you were to leave our audience saying, this is what I would do. This is where I would recommend spending the most time to be most effective?
I would go back to self-assessment and trying to understand where your values are, because I do think that going back to the first moments of the conversation, I do think that board roles are all about values and how to align your personal values, your personal passions to those of the corporation that you're representing. So I think the first step is not necessarily external, but internal, and that's where we can, leverage the 20-plus years of experience with something much softer, but needed.
Right. Well, Maria, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be more boardroom bound.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Maria Garcia Nielsen. It was wonderful to hear the story of someone that we think should be a slam dunk to get on a board, but is still finding, like a lot of us, that there are challenges and there are roadblocks and how to get over those. For example, she was on HBS's board governance course. She was on the very first one, talked about how they gave her so much knowledge, but not necessarily all the tools that she needed, how to take it forward. Some of the literal ones we think about, like the board CV and bio, others about the networking and how to make that work. And it was great to hear how she realized she needed people around her to build up and take that journey with her, which I think we all do. People to hold us accountable, people to give us guidance and feedback. So many lessons from Maria today that we can all apply to our own board journey. Now, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find the links to today's episodes. And please remember that perhaps the most important thing is the Boardroom Bound team and I are just so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. And we are working hard to bring you top quality just like this. So thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more strategies and stories from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.